see from here that there are no differences between mothers that arrived the first trimester or second trimester versus those that arrived in the third trimesters. And you can run the test also for trimester 1 versus trimester 2. Nothing here is significant. Okay? So for example, mother age of birth, the mean was 31. You see that it's about 0.2 of a year of a difference between these two, but standard errors are large. Here it's a third. Again, nothing is significant in this map. Yes?
Do you have any data that would allow you to assess survival selection by trimester?
Which one?
Do you have any data that would allow you to assess survival selection by trimester?
Survival selection.
By
Right,
trimester.
so we look at that, and there are, I think, only 16 children that died between birth and the time we observed them, okay, in a sample. And there are no differences. The sample, the number of deaths is relatively small, and there are no differences by trimesters.
Okay.
So maybe we should include it here. I mean, there are more balancing tests in the paper than this. Just for the sake of time, I'm presenting only a subset of the results.
I appreciate that you typically can't do anything about...
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I appreciate we can't typically do anything about spontaneous abortion or basically fetal death.
This is this is an area where we have little information.
Yeah.
About spontaneous abortions.
Yeah. There might be
but
some...
Let's again postpone that until I will show you the evidence, okay? So much of the results can be seen by just eyeballing this number. So this is the mean outcome by trimester of exposure. So birth weight on average is just over 3 kilos. And you see that the differences between trimesters is very small. I will show you no effect on birth weight. And that has an implication for the interpretation of the evidence. Where is it coming from? This is another outcome. This is, again, a selective set of outcomes. An indicator whether the child have repeated the grade between 6th and 12th grade. You see some differences. We'll see whether they are meaningful economically. Matriculation diploma. This is a very meaningful outcome in Israel, whether you passed all the matriculation exams, about 10 of them, by the end of high school, and got matriculated. This is a prerequisite to enroll in a university. It has an economic return in the labor market by itself beyond its effects on continued schooling. And you see here already some difference, a large difference, okay? About 10 to 0.15 in terms of percentage points. Matriculation units, that's number of units based on your passing exams at high school. You need 22 in order to matriculate, 22 matriculation units. Math units, English units, and what's the proportion of students who studied 5 units in math, which is a math level equivalent to first year calculus in a university program, in a math program. So this is really honor level math classes at high school, okay? Which is highly, highly correlated with IQ. Okay? So some differences emerge. Let's see whether they stand a more rigorous regression analysis of the type we have here. So we have outcome of interest, and then a treatment effect for first exposure, second trimester exposure. The left out is, of course, the third trimester, and we control for characteristic of individuals. It is very nice to state that the estimates of beta 1 and beta 2 are, in general, not sensitive to controlling for xi, naturally because of the balancings, the tests that I showed you. So adding xi to the regression doesn't make much of a difference. Okay? This is a specification when we use the critical period definition based on weeks of gestation. Okay? One thing is lacking here. When we focus on this sample of those born within 9 months window upon arrival to Israel, we are not able to control for 2 important things. One is seasonality in birth outcomes. Okay? There could be month of birth effect. Someone born in February may be different from someone born in July for all kinds of reasons that I don't have time to discuss now. So we really want to control for month of birth effect. Second of all, these 9 months cohorts are spread over 2 cohorts of year of birth. So we want to control for a cohort effect. So month of birth effect, which is seasonality, and cohort effect. You cannot do it with this 9-month sample. So for that, we rely on adding to the sample other parts. One, based on children born in Israel and incepted in Israel. Their parents arrived in Operation Moses. Okay? So these are kids from an Ethiopian origin to parents arrived about 6-7 years earlier than this population. And they were born in Israel, and all the pregnancy was in Israel. The beauty of it is that this group was not treated at all because inception and birth were in Israel. But they can contribute to the identification of seasonal and cohort effect. A second group would be kids who were born in Ethiopia, incepted and born in Ethiopia, and arrived to Israel already after birth. Okay? A third group would be kids who conceived in Ethiopia and born in Ethiopia, but arrived after Operation Solomon. So we have 3 potential groups that we can add to the analysis in order to estimate the cohort effect and the month of birth effect. None of these additional samples will affect the identification of treatment of interest. They only affect how we net out seasonal of birth effect and cohort effect. Okay? So that's what we do in this specification. I don't have time to describe to you how we actually saturate the model with all the relevant effects in order to control for these things. So let's go to the results. So first I'll show you evidence when I use only the 9-month sample, and then evidence based on controlling for month of birth and year of birth effect. Okay? So I will show you evidence for some of the outcomes, not all of them. Again, there are more in the paper. So here we look at the probability that you did not repeat a grade between 6th and 12th grade, and whether you matriculated. I call this attainment, although it's already a measure of quality, whether you matriculated or not, but here it's attainment. So those arrived in the first trimester between week 1 and week 12 of pregnancy, had a lower probability of repeating a grade by about 7 to 8% relative to those who arrived at the 3rd trimester. They had a matriculation rate higher by 14 to 15 percentage points relative to those affected by arriving in the 3rd trimester. The mean of those in the 2nd trimester, or the 3rd trimester, is about 20%, 15%. So this is a huge effect, okay, relative to the mean of those arrived, if you think about it as a counterfactual, arriving in the 3rd trimester. This is a very, very large effect. It's almost doubling the matriculation rate, okay, doubling. The mean for the population in Israel in general is about 50%. So this takes you from a mean of 15% for those arrived in the 3rd trimester to 30%, which closing about almost half of the gap between that group that arrived in the 3rd trimester and the one that arrived in the 1st trimester relative to the Israeli population. Okay? Not much of an effect on matriculation rate in the 2nd trimester, some effect, but not very precise on repetition. Here we add the controls that I mentioned to you in order to get a birth rate effect. It doesn't affect much the estimates on the impact of repetition. It does lower the effect on the matriculation rate, okay, to about 10%. Okay? So it seems like exposure in utero during the 1st trimester in Israel, from the 1st trimester in Israel, have large and significant effect on these attainment outcomes, and not much is visible, especially in matriculation, for exposure from the 2nd trimester. Then we move to the quality magnitudes of the schooling outcomes of these children. So how many matriculation you have accumulated towards the baccalaureate, how many in math, how many in English, and what's the probability of getting a math study program in high school at the highest honor level. Okay? And you see all the effects for the first trimesters are positive and significant. Some of the effects for the second trimesters are positive. Some of them are also significant. These are very large effects. Very, very large effect, yes.
I will choose the city that allows me to get the best care. But if I get in the last trimester, I might not have time to organize.
Here it is. An SES measure of the first locality upon arrival.
Also, you have that data.
Yeah. We control for it, and you see there are no differences, because that's an index produced by the Israeli Statistical Office, and you see no differences.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are these effects large? Okay, 10, 12% matriculation rate. So this is a study that Eric Gould, myself, and Daniel Passerman published in the QGE 2004 when we looked again at this immigration from Ethiopia, called Immigration to Opportunity, where we looked at kids who arrived already, who were born in Ethiopia and arrived to Israel at the beginning of primary school. Okay, they were at the age of beginning primary school. And I don't have time to discuss, but they were dispersed actually in the country randomly. It goes back to your point, randomly. And because of this randomness, they were enrolled randomly in different primary schools of different quality. And we use that as a natural experiment to look at the effect of quality of primary school on their high school outcomes. So we, again, follow them until age 20. In that paper, we found that if you were enrolled in the best from 80th percentile up of high school, primary school quality in Israel in first grade, and you went to school until 6th grade in that school, versus going to the worst schools, worst primary schools in Israel, and you were randomly allocated to those schools, the gain in terms of matriculation was between 5 and 6%. The gain in this paper from exposure in the first trimester to the conditions in Israel is about 10, 12 percentage points. So it's almost double the effect. So in terms of effect size, just coming to Israel in the first trimester versus coming in the second trimester is equivalent to twice the effect of being in the best primary schools in Israel versus the worst primary schools in Israel for your primary school career. So you can envision the effect size. So we want to understand whether there is heterogeneity in the effect. Much of the earlier literature I mentioned suggests that girls are affected more by in utero conditions. They are more sensitive to deficiencies of the supplements that I discussed earlier. Do we see any of that in our results? Okay. The same thing about heterogeneity by family education. Okay. T.W. Schultz, I think, remember when I was a student in Chicago, had a paper about education and disequilibria. This is definitely, this migration is a disequilibria situation. Parents have to deal with a new environment, with information, with access to services that they never had. Schultz have shown that education is very important for farmers in the Midwestern America in dealing with disequilibria. That, in his point of view, that was one of the major important roles of education, how to deal with new information, especially in the short term. Something is asked here. Can parents who are more educated deal better with this shock and transition to a new environment? So we'll look at that. And we do some robustness checks of placebo, etc. So the effect by gender. That's the effect on girls. Yeah. How much time do I have?
Another 5, 10 minutes. Yeah. Why don't we just take the questions at the end? Let it just finish.
Okay. So effect by gender, girls. You can see the effects larger than the 10 percentage points on matriculation that I've seen earlier. Okay. There is some effect in the second trimesters, but it's not precise. Okay. So seemingly larger effects on girls. The effect on boys is about half in terms of point estimates, less than half. That's for boys. But one cannot reject the hypothesis that 0.157 is not different than 0.063 because of the confidence intervals. So we don't have enough power to state that the effect on girls is larger than the effect on boys, but the pattern is that across the different estimates, the effect is larger. Even on repetition, the confidence intervals are not allowing us to say something. Well, maybe here, I think here we can say something that the effect on girls is definitely larger, but not on the matriculation. But these are large effects, okay? Reducing repetition by 13 percentage point, increasing matriculation by 16 percentage points. Those are really huge effects. And in terms of the quality of the study program and the achievements, okay? So this is the effect on girls, larger than we've seen earlier. Interesting here to see, and that's something that we still have to exploit. Look, the effect on matriculation units at the highest level is practically 0 here. So this exposure in the first trimester doesn't do much in terms of inducing girls or improving their innate ability so that they will study math at the highest level, but we do get it on boys, and it's large. So all the effect that we've seen on studying math at the highest level comes from boys and not from girls. Okay? And there are some other effects on boys, like on the matriculation units, but it mainly comes from the effect on math. Okay? So this is not surprising that the effects on girls is somewhat larger than the effect on boys. Again, I'm qualifying when I say larger because it's not significantly larger. Okay? So if I had p-tests here, I would not reject that they are the same. But we tend to be a bit more casual in our language, and I would say that there is a pattern of larger point estimates for girls, although it's not significantly different. So this is not actually unusual. There are many studies that suggest that girls are more susceptible, more highly affected by the environment. I would highlight our own study. Again, it's Gould, Passerman, and Lavy, a paper in Review of Economic Studies 3 years ago, when we look at migration from Yemen to Israel in 1948. Okay? And we follow kids from age 0 to age 60. Okay? And we look at various outcomes and exploit, again, random allocation upon arrival to Israel, and we see that early childhood environment affected mostly girls in all dimensions: education, marriage, fertility, completed schooling, earnings by age 60, and the effects on boys was actually negligible. So even in the context of Israel and the context of immigration from a poor country to a rich country, the effects on girls were larger than the effect of boys. There are similar evidence from other studies. And the explanation is that, for example, Kramer suggests that male are more vulnerable. It attributed in part to the biological fragility of the male fetus, and argues that girls are more likely to survive adverse in utero health conditions. Some argue that boys are more adventurous in utero. They invest more in their nutrition and less in providing nutrition to other parts of the mothers, and that's why they might have a higher likelihood of being affected by severe conditions. There could be a selection issue here in terms of children who arrived at higher weeks of gestation survived a spontaneous abortion more than those who were born in Ethiopia. And so we are comparing actually stronger boys to weaker boys, okay? And that's why we get the effect, but that should work actually against finding anything, and that could not be an explanation for our finding. We look at effect by education. Again, there is seemingly a higher pattern of effect on high education mothers, but that's not across all outcomes. So I would say that there's no conclusive pattern of higher impact among higher education mother. In some outcomes, it is higher. In some outcomes, it is lower. Let me just, I'll be interested to hear the opinion of experts here that know about this more than me. We don't find any effect on birth weight, as we saw already by looking at the simple means of birth weight by trimesters. So you can see that the effect here is positive, but it's very imprecisely estimated. So this is in grams, actually, right? 22 grams, 23 grams, versus 3 kilograms, 3.1 kilograms. So economically, there are very small estimates, and the standard error are larger. So maybe you cannot say that it's a precise zero, but those are very small effects, okay? And they're not significantly different from zero. And some of them have opposite signs when we look at the second trimester. When we look at the probability of low birth weight of being less than 2,500 grams at birth, again, there are no differences in probabilities for this outcome. And very low birth weight, below 1.5 kilos, again, nothing is going on except this one here. Okay? So there are no effects on birth weight. Now, what does it mean? Okay, we have strong, large effect on cognition, no effect on birth weight. Okay? One explanation is that improvements in all these 3 supplements that I mentioned that are make the main difference, actually, of in utero conditions is affecting, as I said, the brain in the first trimester, but it might have a continuous positive effect on nutrition and therefore on birth weight, even if you are exposed only at the second trimester or the third trimester. So there might be a catch-up effect. So if you are exposed in the third trimesters to good nutritional supplements, including iodine and folic acid, etc., you can actually catch up in terms of the deficiencies you experience in the first and the second trimesters of pregnancy. There are no medical evidence that we can rely on this interpretation, so this is suggestive interpretation. That's why we don't find an effect on birth weight, even though the medical literature suggests that all these 3 supplements that I mentioned should have an effect on birth weight. But it could be that the differential exposure by trimester is not enough to generate differences in birth weight, given that at some point in time in pregnancy, these deficiencies were eliminated. Okay? So that could be the explanation why we don't find an effect. We know for certainty that cognitive development, brain development is very important in the first trimesters. That's we have evidence from other studies. Okay? So in a way, not finding an effect on birth weight is kind of nice from our point of view in terms of eliminating the possibility of selection. If there was selection that is driving our results, we should have seen it also in terms of the birth weight. The fact that we don't find anything on birth weight messages beyond the interpretation that I provided that there is no selection, that those born in the third trimesters are not different in unobservables, because I showed you that in terms of observables that are identical to those who arrived in the first trimester. So the message is that there may not be any selection on unobservables that we cannot see in our data that is deriving our results. Is it important, all these differences? Okay? Can people capture payoffs, economic payoffs later on in life that can pay for the cost of providing those supplements? Okay? Although providing those supplements is not very expensive, we know that. But what are the economic payoff? So these individuals are only 22 years old right now, and I cannot analyze meaningfully their post-secondary schooling outcomes and their economic outcomes. But what we did is we used the cohort of kids who came in Operation Moses, who were just 6, 7 years older than these guys, and we looked at their high school matriculation outcomes within the Ethiopian population in Israel and looked at the correlation of those outcomes that you've seen here and post-secondary schooling and earnings by age 30, 32. So here it is. Potential long-term outcome. The access to this data is in a protected lab at one of the research lab of the government of Israel. So we don't have access to this data in my office, but we can work on it in the lab. So for example, a correlation between the matriculation diploma status, whether you have it or not, with annual wages. Okay? So that's the effect in terms of Israeli shekels. That's equivalent to about $14,000. Okay? That's 2012 earnings. And this is the standard error. In terms of matriculation units, each unit is correlated, I wouldn't say in a causal way, each unit is worth about $100 in annual earnings. The matriculation average score is positively correlated. And whether you studied in advanced math, you can see that the effect is almost 7,000 shekels, even though it's not very precisely estimated. Okay? That's, of course, not causal, because if you had advanced math in high school, it means that your innate ability is higher, and that may pay off in the labor market beyond what you do in high school. Then, where is this gains, economic gains in terms of earnings, coming from? Let's look at the correlation between these outcomes and university schooling. And you see that each of these outcomes is correlated with years of post-secondary schooling, with whether you studied at the university or not, okay? And whether and how many years of university schooling you accumulated. Okay, so high school university system in Israel is there are 8 universities and about 60 academic colleges, and admitted to university is much more difficult and requires a matriculation diploma, and it depends on your average score in the matriculation program. So you see that all these correlations based on a regression with controls are significant. So the gains to Ethiopians due to arriving to Israel in the first trimester that I showed you most likely are going to be translated in the next 4 or 5 years to gains in post-secondary schooling, and I will be surprised if it's not follow this pattern, and it will be translated into earnings gains that definitely can compensate for the cost of providing those 3 elements of micronutrient deficiencies during pregnancy. So it seems like transferring a person from a very poor environment in a developing country to a modern environment where the main difference are those 2 supplements give an idea about how important are the gains in terms of human capital and how important are the gains in terms of living standard later on at adulthood. So let me summarize. This is the first study in a way that provide causal evidence of long-term outcome to short-term exposure during pregnancy to better environmental conditions, combining more than one interventions, more than one micronutrient supplement, and estimate the gains in terms of cognition and suggestive evidence about gains in terms of economic outcomes. The earning gains should be expected to be very large at adulthood. They would probably be correlated with gains in productivity and, of course, standard of living. This is, of course, ignoring general equilibrium effect, but in a context, let's say, of Kenya or India, where if this would be affecting the whole population, then one has to take into account general equilibrium effect, okay? The effect on high schools, whether people can attend high school, the capacity constraints, whether everybody can attain university schooling. But that's beyond the scope of this paper. Our effects are not affected by general equilibrium considerations because it's a small population and there are no negative spillovers that can affect others. Okay? In terms of policy implications, I think that for developed countries, I think that the immediate policy implications are how to deal with immigration, perhaps how to target nutritional health programs to immigrants. Understanding this result may suggest that when immigrants arrive, let's say people are coming out of boats in the Mediterranean and landing in southern Italy, one has to take into account the age, to look at pregnant mothers, etc., and target treatments based on the type of evidence that we present here. It also suggests perhaps why we observe intergenerational differences in education and health outcome among parents and children who immigrated. Okay? There's another angle to the evidence